In the fading twilight of the Silla kingdom, as the ancient dynasty tottered on the edge of collapse, a girl was born into a world of uncertainty, power struggles, and the restless winds of change. Her name was not one whispered in the annals of war, nor sung in the ballads of conquest. She was not raised on battlefields nor draped in the symbols of conquest. Instead, she grew up in the quiet strength of political insight, family honor, and an unshakable understanding of the tides of history. That girl would one day become Queen Shinmyung of Goryeo, consort to the founder of a new kingdom and mother to a dynasty. But in her earliest years, she was simply the daughter of Cheongju. Cheongju, nestled amid the hills of central Korea, was a land of modest wealth and strategic consequence. As the kingdom of Silla eroded from within, corroded by corruption, rebellion, and weakening royal authority, Cheongju remained a vital outpost between fractured territories. The Yu clan, to which the girl belonged, held considerable regional influence. They were not of the royal Silla line, but their roots ran deep in the social soil of the region. Her father, a respected nobleman with a reputation for fairness and diplomacy, maintained alliances with both Silla loyalists and the rising warlords challenging the old order. Her mother was known for her discipline and dedication to Buddhist teachings, instilling in the household a sense of ethical purpose and spiritual depth that extended beyond ritual. From a young age, the girl was exposed not just to books and prayers but to the language of politics. She listened carefully during quiet conversations behind sliding doors, absorbing the concerns of her elders as they debated which alliances to uphold, which factions to avoid, and which futures might yet be secured. Her brothers were trained in archery and swordsmanship. She was taught the nuances of tone, silence, observation. While the world beyond Cheongju reeled with warlords vying for power, she became fluent in the unseen politics of gesture and restraint. She learned that true strength often wore no armor, and that to rule the heart of a people, one must first understand its fears. The decline of Silla was not swift but inevitable. By the late 9th century, the three kingdoms had re-emerged, not as ancient entities reborn, but as newer, more desperate claims to legitimacy. Hubeich in the southwest, Goryeo in the north, and in the midst of this fragmentation, Cheongju became both a buffer and a prize. Ambitious leaders looked to the Yu clan as potential allies, eager to bind themselves to a name still trusted by many. Suitors came with promises and swords alike, but the family remained cautious. The girl, now entering womanhood, was neither passive nor easily impressed. Though she was not a warrior, her clarity of thought and calm demeanor became a source of stability in her household. Her father saw in her not just a daughter but a possible bridge to the future. In her, the temperament of diplomacy met the intuition of a leader. It was this quiet strength that would soon catch the attention of a rising force in the north. A general named Wang Geon, serving under the increasingly erratic Gung Yi of Goryeo. Wang Geon was a man born of coastal merchant nobility, a skilled sailor turned military commander. He had grown up far from the central plains of Cheongju, in the northern port town of Songgak, but his reputation had traveled fast. Under Gung Yi, he had led campaigns with tactical brilliance and gained both the admiration of soldiers and the wary curiosity of regional aristocrats. But unlike his paranoid liege, Wang Geon was pragmatic. He understood that force alone would not unify the peninsula. Political cohesion would require more than conquest. Word came to the Yu household that Wang Geon was seeking an alliance, one that would tie his ambitions to the heart of Central Korea. The idea was not new. Many warlords had approached before. But something about this particular figure, this naval commander from the north with no royal blood and no divine mandate, felt different. He spoke plainly but with vision. He did not threaten. He proposed. And when he sent a formal marriage proposal to the Yu clan, it was not delivered with gold or weapons, but with writings, his vision for a future Korea united under reason, not chaos. The girl, who had been prepared her entire life for a moment like this, did not flinch. Her marriage was not merely a union of families. It was the binding of regions, the merging of two legacies into a single thread that might yet guide a broken nation toward cohesion. She accepted the proposal with the same calm determination that had defined her upbringing. The union was sealed in the spring, as cherry blossoms bloomed across the riverbanks near Cheongju. While others saw petals, she saw premonitions of cycles, of old kingdoms falling and new roots taking hold. In Songgak, the court of Goryeo simmered with tension. Gung Ye's madness had begun to alienate his closest allies. Wang Geon, newly wed, returned from Cheongju with more than a wife. He returned with legitimacy. The Yu clan's backing gave him the moral authority to act when the time came. And as Shinmyung entered her husband's court, she was met not with pageantry but with suspicion. Among concubines and advisers, whispers followed her. Why had Wang Geon married a central noblewoman? What would her presence mean for existing power dynamics? She answered no one. Her silence was not weakness but strategy. In the shadows of a paranoid regime, attention could be fatal. So she observed. She memorized the faces of courtiers, the rhythms of court meetings, the way soldiers spoke after wine. She built no faction, but she made no enemies. She prayed openly, served diligently, and faded just enough into the background to become invisible, until the day that invisibility would become power. The rebellion against Gung Ye was swift and decisive. When the time came to remove the Mad King, Wang Geon acted with precision. He was crowned not with imperial fanfare but with the cautious hope of a people exhausted by tyranny. And standing beside him, barely acknowledged in the chronicles of the day, was Queen Shinmyung, the woman from Cheongju, now consort of a king who had no royal blood, but who carried the mandate of necessity. As Goryeo was declared in 918, the new dynasty emerged not from divine descent, but from calculated alliances, strategic marriages, and the hunger for peace. Queen Shinmyung's role in this origin was not one of spectacle but of structure. Her family's alliance provided the new kingdom with regional credibility. Her quiet presence in court offered continuity. She did not rule, but she was the scaffolding on which power was built. In the early years of Goryeo, Wang Geon faced war on every front. While he marched to bring Beech and Silla under one banner, it was Shinmyung who anchored the royal household. She transformed the court into a place of order, rooting out spies and stabilizing internal politics. Through her, old Silla loyalists found a bridge to the new regime. Through her, the aristocracy of the Central Plains began to trust again. But she did not seek titles nor monuments. She was not celebrated in victory processions. Her strength lay in knowing when not to speak, when to observe, and when to act without claiming credit. Behind every decree Wang Geon signed was a web of considerations she had helped him untangle. Behind every peaceful province he claimed was a correspondence she had influenced, a family she had reassured. In the stillness of her private chambers, she kept scrolls of the past, records of fallen kingdoms, teachings of Buddhist sages. The daughter of Cheongju had stepped onto the stage of history not as a queen who demanded the crown, but as the silent architect of a kingdom's foundation. In a time when women were rarely seen as wielders of power, she proved that influence could run deeper than any sword. Her name would not echo in the battlefields, but in the balance she brought to an empire not yet born. And so, as Goryeo took its first breath, Queen Shinmyung stood behind the throne. Not in shadow, but in purpose. The daughter of Cheongju had become the mother of a nation's future. In the dim glow of dawn, as frost clung to the roofs of Songgak and temple bells echoed through the hills of Cheongju, the marriage between two futures quietly took place. There were no roaring crowds or flamboyant proclamations, only measured bows, clasped hands, and silent vows spoken more in purpose than passion. The union of Wang Geon and Lady Yu, soon to be Queen Shinmyung, was not the culmination of romance, but the manifestation of an idea. Their marriage was a thread woven into a grander design, one that neither history nor ambition could ignore. For Wang Geon, already a man of renown under Gung Ye's unstable rule, the marriage offered more than companionship. It brought credibility. The Yu family of Cheongju commanded the respect of Central Korea's aristocracy. holding vital sway over the region's nobles, clerics, and merchants. To bind them to his cause was to secure a pillar of legitimacy in the Central Plains. But legitimacy was only part of it. Wang Geon, though a warrior of calculated aggression, had long admired subtle strength. He had seen it in the tide, the stars, and now, in the quiet composure of his bride. Where other women of the court vied for attention through beauty or cunning, Shinmyung offered a presence that was still and watchful, as if she had already seen the conclusion of events before they began. She entered his household not with fanfare but with a solemn grace, bearing with her a dowry of influence. Connections to Cheongju's most prominent families, loyalty from several key provinces, and, more profoundly, the ability to speak to the doubts and fears of a region weary of civil unrest. Her presence in Wang Geon's circle shifted dynamics. Nobles who once viewed him as a northern warlord now saw a figure bridging both ends of the peninsula. Through Shinmyung, the future king became more than a general, he became a possibility. Her transition into court life was seamless in form but complex in reality. Gung Ye's kingdom was rotting from the core, poisoned by paranoia, cruelty, and spiritual delusion. As Wang Geon's influence grew, so did Gung Ye's suspicion. The court was a place of thin smiles and sharpened words, where every gesture was weighed and every silence scrutinized. Shinmyung, with her years of political observation in Cheongju, knew that one misstep could place her husband in fatal jeopardy. So she watched. She watched Gung Ye accuse his own ministers of treason, watched loyal retainers executed on flimsy suspicions, watched the slow erosion of trust bleed through the corridors like winter wind. And she waited. She said little, but those who served her learned quickly that her silence was not ignorance. It was calculation. Where Gung Ye ruled by divine madness, Shinmyung maneuvered through human insight. She advised her husband in private, never overtly influencing policy, but quietly drawing the map he would one day follow to seize the throne. The marriage between Shinmyung and Wang Geon was not one of poetic passion, but of mutual recognition. Each understood the other's role, and each gave space for that role to flourish. He needed her lineage, her wisdom, and her grounding presence. She needed his ambition, his charisma, and his command of armies. Together, they formed a duality. Visible and invisible, sword and shield, voice and echo. Yet beneath the surface of political alignment, a bond was forming. In the rare hours between campaign reports and council meetings, they shared not intimate whispers, but glances that said more than language aloud. She read the exhaustion behind his measured tone, the burden behind his regal posture. He saw the weight she bore without complaint, the delicate negotiations she maintained behind the scenes among the ladies of the court and the wives of provincial lords. It was not love as sung by minstrels, but love forged in fire and responsibility, an unspoken understanding that each would die for the other's purpose. Wang Geon's growing unease with Gung Ye came to a head in the spring of 918, as the king's behavior became erratic to the point of collapse. Ministers and generals alike feared for their lives. It was Shinmyung who counseled restraint. "Wait for the tipping point," she had once advised her husband behind closed doors. "And you will not have to push, the mountain will fall on its own." And so he waited, until the ministers themselves came to him in desperation, begging for intervention. When the coup was finally executed and Gung Ye was overthrown, Wang Geon stepped into the vacuum not as a usurper but as a rescuer. Through it all, Shinmyung remained a figure of calm. She did not attend war councils, but her influence could be found in the seating arrangements, in the messengers chosen, in the documents reviewed in triplicate. When Wang Geon was declared king of the newly founded Goryeo Dynasty, she did not ascend the throne as a radiant empress, but as the steady consort whose presence made the moment possible. Her official coronation as queen came weeks later, understated but symbolically powerful. She stood beside her husband in ceremonial robes of deep navy and soft gold, her gaze steady, her expression unreadable. With the birth of Goryeo, the marriage between Shinmyung and Wang Geon transformed once more. No longer merely a political union, it became a central axis in a kingdom striving for unity. She took on the responsibilities of queen with quiet precision, reorganizing the inner court, establishing protocols among the consorts, and solidifying alliances with the aristocratic families that formed the backbone of the new regime. Through her, many of these families pledged their loyalty not to Wang Geon directly, but to the idea of stability that she embodied. There were challenges, of course. As queen, Shinmyung was surrounded by rivals. Other consorts, daughters of powerful clans, eager to elevate their own bloodlines. Some brought gifts, others brought threats wrapped in smiles. But Shinmyung never raised her voice, never showed anger. She responded with measured kindness, with strategic magnanimity. Over time, even her enemies came to respect her, not because they loved her, but because she could not be moved. The royal couple's bond grew stronger with the birth of their son, Wang Mu. From the moment of his arrival, Shinmyung devoted herself to shaping not just a prince, but a future king. She raised him not in luxury but in knowledge of people, of law, of the burdens of rule. While other royal children were entertained by jesters and pampered by servants, Wang Mu was taught to listen before speaking, to think before acting. She brought him to council sessions not to participate, but to observe. She made him study the rise and fall of Silla, the reasons kingdoms crumble, the difference between command and wisdom. In her, he found not just a mother, but a tutor in statecraft. Her marriage to Wang Geon had always been built on the understanding of shared purpose. And as years passed, that purpose crystallized. The king would expand the borders, conquer the provinces, and carry the sword of unity. The queen would hold the court together, cultivate the minds that would one day inherit the throne, and ensure that power rested not just on battlefield victories but on moral architecture. There were nights when Wang Geon returned from campaign, weary and bloodied, and found his queen waiting not with tears or ceremony, but with a scroll marked in red ink, highlighting which officials had shifted loyalties, which governors had grumbled, which Buddhist monks had written hymns in his praise. Their conversations were not about love, they were about legacy. And in that, they found a closeness more enduring than affection. The marriage between Shinmyung and Wang Geon became a metaphor for Goryeo itself. Strong, deliberate, forged through hardship, and unshaken by intrigue. It was not perfect, but it was whole. And as the kingdom grew, so too did the silent legend of its queen, the woman who never ruled with a crown, but whose presence shaped every decision that followed. By the end of the decade, the name Shinmyung had become a quiet synonym for stability. Her marriage was no longer just to the man who founded Goryeo, it was to the kingdom itself. She had married not for love, but for the future, and in doing so, she helped create a dynasty that would outlive them both. Within the towering stone walls of the royal palace at Gaejeong, the capital of the newly established Goryeo kingdom, the air was thick not with incense or triumph, but with whispers. The banners of rebellion had fallen, and the cities once torn by war had begun to rebuild under a unified crown. Yet inside the court itself, another kind of battle had begun. One that was not fought with swords or arrows, but with glances, favors, and the slow turning gears of ambition. As King Wang Geon consolidated his rule over a fragmented land, Queen Shinmyung turned her attention inward, to the world behind the silk screens and carved doors, where the shadows of the court moved silently and dangerously. The palace was no longer a mere residence. It had become a mirror of the kingdom's complexity. Ministers, generals, priests, and envoys moved through its corridors in layers of ceremony and secrecy. Some had pledged loyalty out of principle, others out of fear, and a few simply followed power wherever it bloomed. Shinmyung understood this terrain instinctively. While Wang Geon was drawing lines on maps and issuing decrees from war camps, she was charting a map of influence inside the palace, where loyalty shifted like dust in sunlight. Her task was not to control the court overtly. Such a display would only provoke the jealousies of powerful families, but to ensure that its chaos did not seep into the foundation of the new state. She began by observing every gathering of court ladies, Every ceremonial meeting, every whisper in the garden became data. She memorized names, faces, bloodlines, and alliances. She knew which noblewoman's family controlled the northern grain stores, whose brother had fallen out of favor with the military, and who had secretly corresponded with Buddhist monastics resisting royal taxation. It was not paranoia, it was preparation. Among the king's many consorts, Shinmyung held the title of queen consort by right and blood. But title alone did not grant influence. The court was a hive of rival women, many of whom had been married into the royal family for political reasons. Some came from the coastal towns that had supported Wang Geon during his naval campaigns. Others from noble houses that had joined the Goryeo cause late, hoping to preserve their lands and titles. Each brought with them ambitions, grievances, and eyes on succession. And all of them saw Shinmyung not just as the queen, but as the greatest obstacle between them and power. Yet she never stooped to confrontation. Her power did not lie in spectacle but in stillness. When a favored concubine attempted to host a lavish festival without permission, Shinmyung responded not with reprimand but by quietly inviting the concubine's own family elders to a private tea. The woman withdrew her plans the next morning. When rumors spread of discontent among palace scribes loyal to the previous regime, Shinmyung reorganized their lodgings and subtly assigned them duties within the library wing, where their talents were redirected into historical preservation. The unrest faded without a single punishment issued. Her brilliance lay in redirecting energy, not extinguishing it. She knew the court could not be purged of ambition, but it could be balanced. And as the weeks turned into years, a pattern emerged. When conflict brewed, the queen intervened not as an enforcer, but as an unseen hand. The palace came to function not as a chaotic collection of fiefdoms, but as a system with her at its quiet center. Even those who disliked her could not deny the court's growing efficiency under her influence. Yet the greatest challenge came not from women, but from men. The ministers who had survived the fall of Silla and the generals who had fought alongside Wang Geon did not always see the need for a queen with such reach. Some believed her involvement in state matters to be improper. Others simply resented her discretion. They sought to bypass her influence by elevating their own daughters or attempting to speak directly with the king. But Wang Geon, a man not easily manipulated, trusted his queen's instincts more than any flattery. And when he left the capital for extended military campaigns, it was often Shinmyung who oversaw internal affairs, issuing directives in his name with the signature calm that had come to define her reign. Still, she treaded carefully. She never allowed herself to appear too visible. Her decisions were framed as extensions of the king's will. Her interventions were always mediated through formal protocols. And when success was achieved, be it the resolution of a land dispute between two noble families or the peaceful settlement of an inheritance crisis, credit was given to the king or to divine fortune, never to herself. This invisibility was not a sign of weakness, but a strategy born of survival. The women who reached too high too fast often found themselves accused of witchcraft, arrogance, or betrayal. Shinmyung knew this well, so she let others shine when needed, permitted minor victories to be claimed by those whose egos required it, and quietly ensured that every outcome served the greater stability of the realm. Her religious devotion also became a tool of governance. A lifelong adherent of Buddhism, she sponsored the construction of temples not just as acts of piety, but as political investments. Monasteries became centers of learning, diplomacy, and social relief. In an era when the memory of war was still fresh, these temples offered sanctuary, and by aligning them with the throne, Shinmyung further wove herself into the moral fabric of Goryeo. When peasants saw the queen's name inscribed on temple donations, they spoke of her generosity. When monks received royal patronage, they prayed not only for the king's health but for the queen's wisdom. Her role as a mother deepened her influence. Prince Wangmu was growing, and with every passing season, so did the importance of his legitimacy. Rival factions began to quietly push for alternative heirs, sons born to other consorts with ties to newer, more politically powerful families. But Shinmyung had prepared for this long before her son's birth. She had cultivated relationships with the elders of these families, offered subtle honors, and kept the palace's educational officials aligned with her vision of the crown's future. She never made public declarations about her son's right to rule. She didn't have to. The court understood that the queen was not merely raising a prince. She was raising a kingdom's center of gravity. Even so, danger never disappeared. The court was a place where enemies were rarely declared openly. Instead, they waited for weakness, a delayed festival, a misinterpreted decree, a drop in rice yields blamed on a divine displeasure. Any excuse could be used to tarnish her name, so Shinmyung prepared relentlessly. She surrounded herself with attendants of varied backgrounds, not just noble-born but also the daughters of bureaucrats, scribes, and temple acolytes. This diversity of perspective allowed her to understand how decisions echoed through every layer of society. She also maintained an extensive private archive, a collection of scrolls, letters, and reports that chronicled the shifts of power, the rise and fall of alliances, the sentiments in provinces far from the capital. Unlike most rulers who relied solely on reports prepared by ministers, Shinmyung sought knowledge from less obvious sources. Merchant logs, temple donations, seasonal harvest trends. To her, power was not an edict but a pattern. If you could see the pattern, you could anticipate the storm before the clouds arrived. But for all her clarity and control, there were moments of solitude. Late at night, when the palace fell silent and the lanterns in her chamber flickered low, Shinmyung would sit before the ancestral altar and let her thoughts drift. She would think of her youth in Cheongju, the cherry trees lining the riverbanks, the soft voice of her mother reciting prayers. She would think of the war-ravaged fields she had passed on her way to Goryeo, and wonder if they had bloomed again. She would think of the women in the palace who resented her, and ask not why they hated her, but what they feared losing. And most of all, she would think of the future, of a kingdom she would not live to see fully matured, and of a son she hoped would carry not just the name of Goryeo, but its soul. In the shadows of the court, Queen Shinmyung was not an enforcer of power but its guardian. She did not wield the scepter, yet she upheld the throne. Her influence was not declared. It was felt, like the weight of architecture hidden behind beautiful walls. The ministers could argue, the generals could conquer, and the priests could chant, but it was the queen who made it all cohesive. In her stillness there was order. In her silence there was strength. And so, as the court continued its endless dance of ambition and ritual, Shinmyung remained its unshakable axis, unseen by history's loudest voices, yet indispensable to the kingdom they served. Long before the banners of Goryeo were raised across the valleys and mountains of a fractured peninsula, there was another kingdom, a bitter flame sputtering at the edge of collapse. Its name was Goryeo, a resurrection in name only of a mighty past, and its king was Gangyi. In the days before Wang Geon was crowned, before Queen Shinmyung was revered in stillness, Gangyi reigned through fear, cloaked in divine delusion. And in his collapse, the fortunes of those who would shape Korea's future were set in motion, not least the quiet queen, whose husband stood at the eye of a storm she had long seen gathering. Gangye's rise had once seemed destined. A son of royalty who had been cast aside and turned into a rebel priest. His origin fed the desperate hopes of a nation unraveling after the fall of Silla's grip. In the chaos of the later three kingdoms, he promised revival through righteous fury. For a time, people followed him, not out of love, but out of exhaustion. They had seen too many warlords fight for greed. Gangyi at least claimed to fight for heaven. But divinity, when corrupted by ego, becomes tyranny. As Gangye's power grew, so did his paranoia. He declared himself Maitreya, the future Buddha, a divine being no longer beholden to earthly restraint. His court became a theater of terror. Ministers disappeared without explanation. Generals were executed for imagined offenses. The royal palace, once a place of governance, became a shrine to one man's unraveling mind. Wang Geon had been one of Gangye's greatest generals. Loyal, efficient, and brilliant in naval campaigns. His victories brought legitimacy to Gung Ye's reign. Yet the more he succeeded, the more the king resented him. As the general's star rose, Gung Ye saw in him not a comrade, but a threat. And Queen Shinmyung, ever the observer, read the shifting winds with precision. She had seen this pattern before in the courts of Silla and in the whispering halls of her youth. Power that isolates itself, that becomes deaf to dissent, inevitably crumbles. As Gung Ye slipped further into megalomania, Shinmyung urged caution. She advised her husband to retreat from the king's presence where possible, to speak less and listen more, to fortify trust not with proclamations but with actions that could not be twisted. Her instincts were not born of fear, but foresight. She did not know when the fall would come, but she knew it was inevitable. And then the killing began in earnest. Ministers loyal to the old Silla line were accused of heresy and beheaded. Nobles were made to bow before Gung Ye's golden effigies and whipped if they hesitated. Whispers of resistance began to rise, not just among the aristocracy, but among the people. Temples grew uneasy. Generals shared cautious glances at the strategy table. And in these silent exchanges, the foundation of a coup began to form. But it was not Wang Geon who moved first. It was the court itself, his peers, the commanders, the scholars who came to him. They had seen his leadership, his discipline, his refusal to indulge in Gung Ye's madness. They trusted him. More than that, they needed him. No one else could command both the respect of the northern provinces and the loyalty of the central families. And when they knelt before him, imploring him to act, Queen Shinmyung stood beside him, calm, composed, offering no public endorsement. But her presence said enough. It was in the summer of 918 that Gung Ye's reign finally cracked. The military council moved swiftly. Gung Ye fled the palace, cursing his traitors, promising divine retribution. He was captured in the mountains days later, his robes tattered, his eyes vacant. He died not as a prophet, but as a man consumed by the very illusions he once used to inspire. The moment Wang Geon was named the new ruler, history bent. Not because of the spectacle, but because of what followed. Unlike the purges that marked Gung Ye's final years, Wang Geon refused to retaliate. He offered clemency to former enemies, protected the families of executed ministers, and reopened the court to scholars who had been exiled. This was not weakness. It was design. It was the beginning of Goryeo. And within this transition, Queen Shinmyung played her most delicate role yet. She oversaw the quiet transformation of the inner court, where once Gung Ye's wives had spoken in fearful riddles. Now the court women gathered in honest service. She ensured that none were humiliated, that the transition of power was wrapped not in revenge, but in dignity. She personally attended to the preparation of ceremonies that honored both the new dynasty and the lessons of the past, public symbols of renewal without erasing memory. Outside the palace, there were riots to suppress, rebellions to quell, and provinces to unify. Inside, there were bloodlines to manage, alliances to formalize, and faith to rebuild. Shinmyung became the axis upon which the balance between public stability and private power turned. She began coordinating with temple leaders, advocating for spiritual renewal that embraced both royal authority and Buddhist ethics. Her guidance led to the founding of new monastic centers, where prayers for national unity replaced the fractured chants of sectarian fear. She also used her position to quietly reweave the noble families into the new regime. The daughters of former Gung Ye loyalists were married into military families aligned with Wang Geon. Land grants were distributed not as rewards for loyalty alone, but as investments in harmony. Shinmyung orchestrated these marriages and distributions with such subtlety that few noticed the guiding hand behind them. To the court, the kingdom seemed to be stabilizing naturally. In truth, it was the queen who was conducting the rhythm. One of her greatest challenges during this time was the public memory of Gung Ye himself. Though his tyranny was clear, many among the peasantry had once believed in his spiritual message. To erase him entirely would only martyr him. To honor him would legitimize his madness. So Shinmyung proposed a middle path. Temples were instructed to record his life truthfully, with emphasis on his early ideals and later decline. His name was not vilified, but framed as a warning against unchecked power. Through this, Goryeo established a precedent, not of erasure, but of tempered remembrance. In the years following Gung Ye's fall, Wang Geon turned his focus outward. He launched campaigns to absorb Hubeish and bring Silla's remaining provinces under the Goryeo banner. But as he moved across the land, it was Shinmyung who kept the capital breathing. She supervised the upbringing of not only her son, the crown prince, but of other royal children, each one a potential node of conflict if left untended. She ensured their education in philosophy, governance, and history, so that should succession become contested, no child of Goryeo would be unprepared. She also expanded the court's cultural mission. Under her guidance, artisans were summoned to the capital, not only to decorate temples but to create scrolls, maps, and annals. Calligraphy schools were founded under royal patronage. Music halls began to incorporate elements from across the peninsula. It was her vision that Goryeo would not simply be a political entity, it would be a cultural reawakening. And yet, for all her efforts, she remained in the shadows. Wang Geon, ever aware of court politics, knew that too much visibility for the queen could provoke envy. So their collaboration continued as it always had. In shared glances, in coded language, in rituals practiced together at temple altars. Theirs was a governance of synchronization, not command. Shinmyung's experience during Gung Ye's fall became a blueprint for how she would approach future challenges. She understood that regimes are not only toppled by violence, but also by erosion of trust, by isolation, by pride. She had seen what happens when a ruler listens only to sycophants, when fear replaces consultation. And she vowed, in her own quiet way, never to allow such rot to take root in Goryeo. When news of Gung Ye's death spread across the land, some rejoiced, others wept. Many simply moved on. But within the palace, Queen Shinmyung marked the moment in a solitary ritual. She lit incense not for the man he had become, but for the possibility he once represented. She knew that history is made not only by victors, but by those who choose how the past is remembered. And in her memory, Gung Ye would be both a tyrant and a warning, a shadow that would never again darken the foundation of a throne. Thus, in the fall of one king, the rise of another found its compass. And at the center of it all stood a queen, not crowned in glory, but in purpose. Her eyes had seen the unraveling of power. Her hands had steadied the vessel as it turned. And her voice, though rarely heard, had shaped the silence into something enduring. Their trust in institutions had thinned to threads. It was in this fragile moment that a kingdom needed more than victory. It needed form, meaning, identity. It needed to become real. And while King Wang Geon carried the sword that had carved Goryeo's name into the soil, it was Queen Shinmyung who gave that name its roots. The foundation of a kingdom is rarely laid in the roar of battle. It is shaped in silence, in decisions made behind closed doors, in names written on scrolls, in alliances crafted over shared meals and long walks through courtyards. Shinmyung knew this better than anyone. With the crown settled on her husband's head and the chaos of Gung Ye's reign behind them, her focus turned to the unseen scaffolding that would uphold the dynasty they had risked everything to build. Gaejeong, the new capital, was her starting point. The city had once been a modest trade center, but under the Goryeo banner it now stood as the political and spiritual heart of a new era. It was where edicts would be issued, where generations would be educated, where the memory of division would be overwritten by the promise of unity. Queen Shinmyung took charge not only of the palace's internal order but of its symbolic presence in the capital. Architecture was never neutral in her eyes. It communicated stability, wisdom, intention. The royal residence was renovated not with extravagance but with balance, its layout reflecting both Silla symmetry and Goryeo fortitude. Temples were built on higher ground, overlooking the capital like guardians of thought. Market roads were widened, not only for commerce but for the parades of unity she knew would follow. The queen's role in this was unacknowledged publicly, but evident in every detail. She invited artisans from every province, Silla metalworkers, Beeksh woodcarvers, and Goryeo muralists to decorate the palace. Their collaboration created a visual language of inclusion, a message that this new kingdom was not a victor's prize but a shared home. When ministers questioned the inclusion of Beeksh artists, she reminded them in careful silence that loyalty was not inherited. It was earned. While King Wang Geon held court and consolidated external power, Shinmyung turned her attention to the court structure. The bureaucracy that had survived from Silla was outdated, fragmented, and often corrupt. She quietly supported reform by sponsoring scholars who had once been cast aside under Gung Ye's regime. These were thinkers, not warlords, men and women who understood law, ritual, and administration. With her backing, the palace library was expanded, its scribes protected and paid. The new Goryeo legal code began not with a royal edict, but with notes passed discreetly between the queen and a group of trusted scholars. They worked under her patronage in monastic halls, surrounded by both scrolls and incense. Queen Shinmyung also understood the power of women within a dynastic system. The royal harem, often dismissed as a place of beauty and rivalry, became under her stewardship a school of influence. She reorganized the ranks of consorts not solely based on noble birth, but on capability. Women who could read and write were given charge of correspondence. Those with knowledge of household management oversaw the palace economy. Even the daughters of lesser nobles were trained in diplomacy and record-keeping. The queen was not building a court of adornment. She was cultivating an institution. Her reforms extended to marriage alliances, the lifeblood of aristocratic politics. Rather than allowing provincial governors to marry off daughters for quick favor, she reviewed each proposal with care. She knew which families bore lingering resentment from the wars, which clans had shifted allegiances too quickly, and which lines had held firm when others wavered. Every marriage she approved bound Goryeo tighter, not just in name, but in blood. And in a time when disloyalty could emerge from within a banquet hall as easily as from a battlefield, these unions became her greatest fortress. Religion, too, became a cornerstone of her statecraft. Buddhism was the faith of the people, the clergy, and increasingly the crown. But Shinmyung saw in it not only spiritual value but civic utility. She directed funds toward the building of temples in border provinces, often where Wang Geon's authority was most tenuous. Monks trained under royal patronage carried not just prayers but news, law, and tax records. By aligning the throne with Buddhism, not as divine rule, but as moral governance, Shinmyung offered the people something they had not felt in years: ethical leadership. She also ensured that Buddhism remained a bridge, not a wall. While monks were welcomed at court, they were expected to contribute to the state. Some served as scribes, others as advisors on land management. She brought balance to their privileges, allowing religious institutions to flourish without becoming parasitic. This harmony between throne and temple became one of the defining features of early Goryeo, and it was Shinmyung who had engineered it with careful grace. Her relationship with the people remained distant, but meaningful. She rarely appeared in public, but when she did, her presence was precise. She would visit orphanages after flood seasons, walk barefoot into temples during drought prayers, and fund harvest festivals that reminded farmers of their central role in the kingdom's future. Her image was embroidered onto prayer flags, but in consensus, ministers sought her counsel discreetly. Foreign envoys measured the weight of her silence. When conflict arose between generals over provincial taxes, it was Shinmyung's intermediaries who delivered compromise. When a major famine threatened the southern provinces, it was her preemptive stockpiling of grain that prevented riots. The king was the face of strength, but she was its rhythm. Her greatest test came not in a crisis of war, but in succession. The question of the crown prince's future emerged earlier than expected. Wang Mu, their son, was brilliant and composed, but his rivals, born of other consorts, began to gather support among generals and ministers. Queen Shinmyung did not panic. She returned to the same strategy she had always used: preparation. She commissioned a record of Wang Mu's education, his provincial visits, his temple studies, his command of etiquette. But the court's shared investment. When a group of ministers quietly petitioned the king to consider another son, citing military credentials and noble bloodlines, the petition was met with polite dismissal. Wang Geon had already decided, but it was Shinmyung who had shaped the decision years before the question was ever asked. As the years passed, Goryeo's borders stabilized, trade resumed, roads were rebuilt, and the chroniclers began writing not about civil war, but about law, temples, marriages, harvests. It was in this season of consolidation that Shinmyung reached the height of her invisible power. She held no sword. She signed no decrees. But without her, about peace. When a grand statue was proposed in her honor, she refused, suggesting instead that the funds be used to build a library near the palace gates, where anyone, noble or not, could come to read. She was not interested in being remembered. She was interested in what would remain after she was gone. And so, as the kingdom of Goryeo stretched its borders southward and westward, absorbing lands that once belonged to Hubeich and the fading remnants of Silla, the people began to believe in unity again. The years of fire and blood were not forgotten, but they were slowly being replaced by the rhythms of farming seasons, merchant routes, temple bells, and court proclamations. For the first time in decades, Korea was becoming one land again. Yet beneath the visible symbols of power, the armies, the treaties, the coronation ceremonies, there stood an invisible architecture without which unity would have collapsed. At the heart of that architecture was Queen Shinmyung. She had no military title. She commanded no provinces. Yet she held the threads that bound the kingdom together more tightly than any general. While King Wang Geon led the campaigns that crushed Hubeich and forged a path toward a unified peninsula, it was Queen Shinmyung who held the realm steady in his absence, ensuring that victory on the battlefield did not lead to chaos at home. She did not simply wait for the king's return. She governed in silence. The inner court was her domain, and through it, she extended her influence outward. She organized networks of informants not as spies, but as observers, women placed within noble households, monastic communities, and even market towns, tasked with listening to the pulse of the people. These reports, delivered in plain letters, revealed more about the kingdom's state than any ministerial briefing. Through them, she learned of unrest before it spread, of famines before they turned to riots, of conspiracies before they found courage. She acted swiftly but without spectacle. A gift sent to a grieving family. A priest dispatched to a restive village. A marriage proposal redirected to neutralize ambition. Every action subtle, every gesture precise. When southern provinces raised concerns about taxation under the new regime, Shinmyung organized a delegation of monks and magistrates, not soldiers, to listen and report back. The message was clear. This was not a conquering power, but a government. The people were not to be ruled, they were to be folded into the future. And they were being folded, one quiet act at a time. Among the most powerful tools at her disposal were the royal women, daughters, consorts, nieces, and allied noblewomen. Where most courts viewed women as ornaments or obstacles, Shinmyung saw a council. She trained them in administration, ritual, and court diplomacy. Through their marriages and their presence in regional households, they carried the queen's vision with them. In remote provinces, where the king's seal felt distant, the presence of a royal woman reminded all that the center had not forgotten the periphery. She was not a revolutionary. She did not seek to upend tradition, only to refine it. In her view, stability came from rhythm, not from reform for its own sake. Her genius was not in creating new systems, but in harmonizing the old ones into a single, coherent song. She took the fractured legacies of Silla, Beech, and Goryeo and wove them together into a ritual order that gave Goryeo cultural gravity. From temple festivals to seasonal ceremonies, from judicial precedents to education policies, Shinmyung worked to create a kingdom that felt familiar to all, yet loyal to one throne. At the palace, her influence deepened. The royal bureaucracy began to mirror her methods, measured, patient, meticulous. She discouraged court spectacle, preferring documents over declarations. Ministers found themselves held to higher standards not by law, but by expectation. Those who sought favor learned quickly that merit and humility earned more than titles. And in this environment, the court began to stabilize, not because power had been centralized, but because it had been rendered intelligible. The queen's spiritual patronage expanded during this time, not in grandeur, but in reach. She founded small temples in every major region, each named not for herself, but for virtues, compassion, harmony, insight, vigilance. These temples doubled as community centers, offering education, mediation, and seasonal relief. They became the moral outposts of the kingdom, where her name was spoken not in reverence, but in gratitude. Her role as a mother, too, became part of the political design. Crown Prince Wangmu was no longer a child. Under her careful guidance, he had grown into a young man fluent in the languages of history, law, and statecraft. She had raised him not in isolation but in communion with the court's many voices. He knew the sons of ministers, the sons of scholars, the sons of soldiers. He had visited farms, courts, and temples. He was not only her son, he was the son of the state. And while rival claimants still lingered, their voices were dimmed by the prince's preparation. The queen had given Goryeo not just a king, but a future king ready to lead without being feared. Still, not all was calm. The edges of the kingdom remained restless. Pirate raids along the coast, whispers of rebellion among disgruntled nobles, and the always simmering threat of Tang Chinese entanglement reminded the court that Goryeo's unity was still fragile. But Shinmyung was never complacent. She reinforced diplomatic ties with distant courts through emissaries and gifts, always modest, always deliberate. She commissioned scholars to study foreign customs, not for curiosity, but to prevent surprise. And she kept a personal record of every courtier's rise and fall, their kinships, debts, and alliances. It was not paranoia, it was architecture. Inside the palace, she began codifying ceremonial behavior. She knew that ritual was memory's language, that people remembered crowns less through laws and more through what they saw, heard, and touched. Every festival, every court entry, every wedding, every coronation rehearsal was rehearsed under her watchful eye. She did not just maintain tradition, she created it. And in doing so, she shaped how Goryeo saw itself. To the people, she remained distant but dependable. To the ministers, she was inscrutable but indispensable. To the king, she was the compass in every storm. And to her son, she was the standard he would spend a lifetime trying to match. There were no poems written in her name during her lifetime, no monuments erected, but the country she held together with invisible threads began to show signs of cohesion that went deeper than victory. Farmers in the far south paid taxes not with bitterness but with resignation. Monks in the north invoked the royal name in daily chants. Generals began to defer to court ministers, recognizing the need for administration after conquest. These were not accidents, they were her design. Wang Geon himself began to acknowledge the quiet miracle unfolding within his court. Though he never proclaimed it publicly, he ensured that the queen's seal was affixed beside his on matters of inheritance, temple grants, and royal appointments. The gesture was symbolic, but everyone in court knew its meaning. Shinmyung was not merely the king's wife. She was the co-architect of Goryeo. The silent architect, that was how later scholars would describe her, though she never claimed the title. Her power was not that of decree, but of design. She understood that unity is not forged with weapons or declarations. It is built with habit, trust, memory, and presence. She lived in those elements, invisible and unshakable. And so, as Goryeo moved from a kingdom in formation to a kingdom in consolidation, Queen Shinmyung stood at the invisible heart of its stability. She did not command, she aligned. She did not shine, she structured. And in doing so, she became the very thing every new dynasty needs, but rarely recognizes in time: the soul of a kingdom. In the twilight hours of the palace, long after the courtyards had quieted and the sound of sandals on stone had faded into distant echoes, Queen Shinmyung often sat alone. She would light a single oil lamp, place her hands upon her lap, and turn her gaze to the wooden scroll boxes lined neatly across the chamber wall. Within them were records, not of wars or politics, but of her son's growth. Letters from tutors, progress reports in calligraphy and statecraft, notes from temple priests detailing his questions during meditation. To any other mother, they might have seemed like proud souvenirs, but to her, they were blueprints, proof that the future was being carved with care, discipline, and foresight. From the moment he was born, Wang Mu was not merely her child. He was the vessel of continuity. His life was not his own, and Queen Shinmyung made no effort to romanticize it. She understood that the dynasty her husband had founded could not survive unless its future ruler was more than a name on parchment. Her son had to be a bridge between the war-weary past and the fragile, uncertain future, and she, as queen and more so as mother, would ensure he became just that. She began not with indulgence, but with structure. While other princes were swaddled in silks and cradled by singers, Wang Mu was placed beneath the tutelage of old scholars, men who had lived through the fall of Silla and knew how power, once mishandled, could unravel entire worlds. They taught him Confucian ethics, Buddhist metaphysics, and the legal codes of rival kingdoms. From them he learned that righteousness was not the same as victory, and that mercy, though costly, outlasted conquest. But the education Queen Shinmyung provided was not limited to texts. She immersed her son in the practical textures of rule. He sat in on minor court hearings, where he listened to land disputes and inheritance quarrels. He toured granaries and warehouses, watched taxes being counted and disputes settled. He was sent to rural temples to spend time in isolation, fasting with monks, drawing water from wells, and copying sutras with frozen fingers. Every hardship was intentional. The queen did not want her son to rule with confidence. She wanted him to rule with understanding. His playmates were carefully chosen, not just noble children, but the sons of generals, the daughters of ministers, even the grandchildren of local scribes. She created a court within a court, an environment where the future king would grow surrounded by every voice that might one day sit before his throne. In this way, Wang Mu learned early that alliances are forged not only through contracts, but through shared memory. Of course, the palace was not free of jealousy. As the crown prince's position solidified, the mothers of his half-brothers grew restless. Each had their own bloodlines, ambitions, and hidden supporters among the bureaucracy and military. Rumors circulated about Wang Mu's supposed fragility, about his lack of battlefield experience, about his excessive reliance on monks. Some whispered that a true successor should be forged in war, not molded in temples. Queen Shinmyung did not silence them. She watched, and when the time came, she allowed her son to speak for himself. At a public festival honoring the harvest, he addressed the court, not with fanfare, but with conviction. He spoke of unity not as a finished goal, but as a daily effort, and of markets as altars for the people's trust. His speech echoed through the capital like a bell rung for clarity. The whispers died down not because they were crushed, but because they had no ground left to stand on. The queen continued shaping not just her son, but the narrative of his inheritance. She commissioned artists and scribes to begin recording a visual and textual history of Goryeo, not just of battles and kings, but of reforms, rituals, and festivals. The crown prince appeared in paintings distributing food to villagers, discussing scripture with abbots, watching artisans at work. These images were circulated among temples and provincial governors. Slowly, the people stopped wondering who would follow King Wang Geon. They began expecting Wang Mu. Still, the queen knew that perception was only part of the task. A ruler must not only be accepted, he must be tested. And so, she arranged for the prince to travel. Not in parades, but in modest convoys. He visited regions still bitter from Goryeo's consolidation. He sat with local leaders who remembered the old kingdoms. He listened. He mediated. He learned how to absorb tension without reacting, how to promise reform without losing control. These experiences marked him. When he returned to Gaejeong, he walked with the posture of someone who understood weight. Not just authority's weight, but responsibilities. Within the palace, Queen Shinmyung began preparing for withdrawal. Not retirement, not abdication, just space. She reduced her public appearances, quietly elevating her trusted attendants to handle daily ceremonies. She allowed the prince to represent the crown at seasonal rituals. She even stepped aside during some state receptions, citing the importance of the younger generation's presence. These actions weren't weakness. They were choreography. The queen was not stepping down. She was stepping aside, guiding her son forward while still shaping the floor beneath him. And in this slow transfer of symbolic power, a transformation occurred. Ministers who once petitioned the king now consulted the crown prince. Temple leaders began addressing him directly. Foreign envoys remarked on the prince's eloquence, noting that his words bore his mother's clarity and his father's resolve. Goryeo, still young, began to feel generational. It wasn't without struggle. The prince occasionally faltered, misjudging a regional tax, overpromising support to a temple faction, misreading a noble's veiled threat. But Queen Shinmyung never shielded him. Instead, she let him face the consequences, guiding him only in private, offering counsel in the form of questions, not commands. In this way, she ensured that every mistake became a lesson etched into the grain of his governance. Their relationship, though public, remained deeply private. Few in the court ever saw them speak at length. Yet their synchronization was unmistakable. The way his appointments mirrored her values. The way her reforms made room for his initiatives. They were not ruler and regent. They were origin and continuation. One winter, a group of scholars presented a series of recommendations for court reform, proposals that would further empower the bureaucracy and limit direct royal intervention in local matters. It was a bold, even dangerous suggestion, but to the court's astonishment, both the king and the crown prince supported it. And it was Queen Shinmyung who had first convened the scholars in a quiet wing of the palace library, months before the proposal was ever made public. She understood that a dynasty cannot live by tradition alone. It must adapt or decay. In private, she kept writing. Not memoirs, not manifestos, but lessons. Scrolls titled simply, "On Patience," "On Listening," "On Stillness Before Action." They were meant for her son, and perhaps for his children after him. She made no attempt to assert eternal truth. Instead, she recorded questions that had guided her. What does it mean to rule without ruling? How can silence serve justice? When does a throne become a burden too heavy to carry alone? These writings would remain hidden for years, only discovered generations later, when scholars sought to understand how the first queen of Goryeo had shaped so much without ever raising her voice. As the kingdom entered a period of peace and cultural blooming, Shinmyung became less a figure of power and more a figure of reverence. Portraits began to include her image beside the king, not as background but as equal presence. In temples, monks began to refer to her not as merely the queen, but as the mother of order. The phrase appeared in hymns, etched into prayer stones, whispered during rituals for national harmony. Yet even as her son matured, and the court grew more deferential to him, Queen Shinmyung never stepped fully into the light. She refused calls for a co-regency. She declined formal titles beyond those already granted. She never wore the elaborate robes reserved for imperial matriarchs in foreign courts. Her presence remained that of gravity, not decoration, not dominance, but weight. By the time Wang Mu stood at the cusp of his father's throne, the queen had already completed her work. Not by writing history's boldest chapter, but by ensuring its next chapter could be written at all. She had raised a ruler. She had shaped a court. She had fortified a kingdom from within. And she had done it all with the quiet resolve of someone who knew that dynasties are not built by loudness, but by legacy. She was not merely the mother of a king. She was the mother of a dynasty. The calm that had settled over the palace in Gaejeong was not the stillness of peace, but the tense quiet that precedes a storm. King Wang Geon was aging. His journeys across the provinces had become shorter. His once commanding voice grew more measured, and on some mornings, he did not attend court at all. Rumors began to circulate about his health, his strength, his ability to hold the realm together. The whispers were not spoken aloud. Not yet. But in the subtle shifts of the court's rhythm, Queen Shinmyung recognized the signs. The trials of succession had begun. To the people, the matter seemed settled. Crown Prince Wangmu was already functioning in near-regal capacity, leading ceremonies, issuing edicts, and resolving disputes across the provinces. To the scholar class, his rise represented continuity, evidence that Goryeo would be a dynasty, not a fleeting kingdom. But inside the court, where ambition nested in every corner, succession was never simply a matter of birth. It was a matter of timing, alliances, leverage, and fear. The queen knew this intimately. She had watched similar tensions destroy kingdoms, fragment alliances, and turn blood relatives into enemies. Wang Geon had fathered many sons by many women, and each son was a potential center of gravity for a faction hoping to bend the future toward itself. Some had military backing. Others carried regional weight through marriage or clan ties. While they outwardly acknowledged Wang Mu's status as heir, their private gatherings, gift exchanges, and subtle avoidance of ceremonial obligations told another story. It was not treason. She offered no threats, only clarity. Goryeo could not afford a succession crisis. She did not demand allegiance to her son. She asked for allegiance to the throne. And to many, that distinction was persuasive. But not all were swayed. The queen's influence, so long respected, was now viewed by some as overreach. The mothers of rival princes met in private. Generals who owed their titles to former alliances began to question the direction of the court. A new undercurrent emerged, one that painted Shinmyung as the true power behind the crown, manipulating the king, the court, and the line of succession for her own bloodline. Shinmyung did not deny her influence. She could not, nor did she apologize for it. Instead, she turned once more to her greatest strength: preparation. She worked with court scribes to compile a comprehensive chronicle of Wang Mu's record, his judgments, his reforms, his correspondence with temples and provinces. This dossier, copied and distributed among senior ministers and monastic leaders, was not a defense. It was a reminder. It said, "This is not the queen's choice. This is the realm's trajectory." She also focused her energy on the crown prince himself. She met with him more frequently, not to advise but to test. She questioned his assumptions, challenged his interpretations, presented him with hypothetical crises. How would he respond if the army in Jiala refused to pay taxes? What if a senior monk denounced the court's legitimacy? What if one of his own brothers raised a banner in the West? These were not idle drills. They were a forge, and through them, Wang Mu grew sharper, not more ruthless but more resilient. Even as the court swayed between anxiety and anticipation, the people outside the palace remained largely unaware. Harvests were stable. Trade routes were secure. Temple festivals continued as scheduled. This was Queen Shinmyung's greatest defense. While power fluctuated in court, she ensured the country remained steady. No famine, no flood, no scandal. In a world where perception often preceded truth, she crafted a reality that denied rebellion the fuel it needed. Still, she knew the moment of transition would come. The king's health declined more rapidly as winter approached. He spoke less, slept longer, and began transferring official duties to Wang Mu with solemn ritual. There were no dramatic declarations, only the slow, deliberate passing of responsibility, from father to son, from founder to future. But as the king receded, uncertainty returned. The factions that had gone quiet began to stir. They questioned the timing. They invoked omens. Some whispered that the transition was being engineered too quickly, that the queen was pressing before the realm was ready. It was an attempt to dilute Wang Mu's authority and fracture the throne before it could fully pass into his hands. The petition was delivered to the king in his chamber, but Queen Shinmyung had already received word of it. She met with Wang Mu that evening, presenting him with the document and a choice. Respond with anger and fuel their fears, or respond with clarity, and remove their pretext. The prince chose clarity. At the next council, he addressed the court directly, thanking the authors, whoever they were, for their concern. He acknowledged the pain of the past, the fragility of the present, and the weight of the future. Then he stated, without arrogance, that the strength of a kingdom lay not in shared power, but in shared purpose, and he asked the ministers a question. Who among them would benefit from a divided realm? The chamber was silent, not because the answer was unclear, but because it had already been spoken. Days later, King Wang Geon summoned his son, placed a jade seal in his hands, and told him what only a father can say, that the throne was not a prize, but a duty, that ruling would cost him peace, that the people would not always love him, but they must always trust him. And then, with Queen Shinmyung present, the king named Wang Mu as his successor, formally and irrevocably. The transition was not without tension, but it was without blood. No swords were drawn, no provinces rebelled. The rival sons, their ambitions spent, accepted positions of honor and distance. And through it all, Queen Shinmyung remained composed. She did not gloat. She did not weep. She attended the coronation in simple robes, standing slightly behind the throne, not as a regent, not as a ruler, but as the mother of the dynasty fulfilled. In private, she wrote that night in her scrolls, "It is not triumph to secure succession. It is triumph to secure unity after succession." Her work was not complete. Her vigilance would remain. But in that moment, as the bells of Goryeo rang in a new reign, Queen Shinmyung allowed herself a rare breath of stillness. She had guided the kingdom through birth, war, reform, and now, she watched as her son took the mantle, not merely as king, but as the continuation of a dream she and her husband had forged from chaos. In that passing of power, the queen's role transformed once more. No longer the hand behind the throne, she became its memory. The silent architect of unity had completed her masterpiece. She had been the guiding force behind Goryeo's formation, the architect of its courtly harmony, the silent engineer of a seamless succession. Yet Queen Shinmyung never ruled. Her influence shifted from governance to guidance, from command to memory, as she stepped into a role the chronicles would never formally name. The queen who never ruled, yet ruled nonetheless. Goryeo no longer pulsed with uncertainty. The new king, Haejong as he would later be known, had assumed power with rare grace. His ascension had neither fractured the court nor emboldened enemies. Instead, it marked a continuation of unity, of law, of dignity. And much of that continuity stemmed from Queen Shinmyung's refusal to grip the throne as her own. In foreign courts, mothers of kings often assumed power in transition, governing on behalf of sons, holding the reins until the younger generation matured. But Shinmyung had never intended to wear the crown. She had always designed herself as its foundation, not its occupant. After the coronation, she withdrew from public view not as retreat, but as ritual. Her appearances at court became rare, reserved only for major ceremonies. She declined requests to sit beside her son in council, preferring to remain in the shadows of the antechamber. And when foreign dignitaries asked to meet the mother of the king, they were greeted by her attendants instead, graceful women trained in her voice and tone, echoing her philosophy without ever quoting her directly. She had become an institution within the court, not bound by presence, but by influence. Her role was no longer visible but vital. And read aloud from Buddhist sutras. Her days were spent reviewing provincial reports, not as a ruler, but as a scholar, keeping herself informed, vigilant. She received visitors selectively. She continued writing. Her scrolls evolved from political reflections to meditations on leadership, legacy, and mortality. She wrote not as a queen, but as a witness to time. The bureaucracy she helped reform became the spine of Haijong's reign. The court rituals she codified now marked the calendar. The temple networks she established continued to serve as centers of social care and spiritual alignment. Even her tone, firm but measured, had shaped the way court debates unfolded. Ministers quoted her without naming her. Poets wrote verses about wisdom that moved without sound. Yet her detachment from power did not mean indifference. When the court faced dilemmas, especially those involving ethics, ritual, or the balance between tradition and reform, her voice found its way back into the chamber, carrying scrolls or letters requiring her insight. They rarely spoke of titles or decrees. Their conversations meandered through philosophy, poetry, and memory. She guided him as she always had, not by dictating what he should do, but by helping him see clearly what he already knew. She encouraged him to trust his own judgment, and when he failed, as all rulers do, she reminded him that error is the echo of learning. In those private exchanges, the line between queen and mother blurred. Their bond was no longer about preparation, but about presence. She had raised him to rule, and now, she stood beside him not as a protector, but as a mirror. Through her, he remembered humility. Through him, she witnessed the endurance of everything she had built. But even as her influence lingered, Queen Shinmyung knew her role was nearing its final chapter. She began preparing for what others feared to name. She selected the temple where she would retire. She chose the names of the women who would tend to her scrolls. She requested no monument, no burial within the royal mausoleum. Her only request was for her ashes to be scattered near the pine groves overlooking the Taedong River, where she had once walked alone as a young bride, uncertain of her place in a kingdom yet unborn. The court resisted. Ministers argued that she should be enshrined beside her husband. Temple abbots pleaded for her presence in sacred halls. But she refused. Her legacy was already carved, not in marble, but in the habits of a kingdom. In the rituals she left behind, in the sun she had shaped, in the silence she had kept. When the time came, she fell ill without fanfare. She received no endless parade of physicians. She refused elaborate rites. In her final days, she summoned only a few. Her son, now fully a king. And when the announcement came to the court that Queen Shinmyung had died, the silence that followed was not one of shock, but of reverence. The capital did not erupt in mourning rituals. Instead, temples across the land held coordinated recitations of the Heart Sutra, prayers chanted not for her soul's salvation, but in gratitude for her presence. Farmers lit lanterns in the fields. Scribes left their desks bare for one day. Even the king observed a day of silence, not mandated but chosen. No throne had ever borne her weight. No era had carried her name. But Queen Shinmyung had ruled in the spaces where history seldom looks, in the quiet corridors of continuity, in the patient architecture of peace, in the invisible balance that makes power human. The court functioned without disruption. King Haijong, her son, continued her policies with measured confidence. The bureaucracy remained intact. The temples offered blessings. But beneath the surface, new forces had begun to stir. Forces that had long awaited the absence of the one figure no one dared to challenge. The cracks did not appear all at once. They formed in quiet corners, in the ambitions of those who had tolerated unity out of deference to the queen's authority. Her departure left a vacuum, not just of wisdom, but of fear. Her influence had restrained the court's sharper instincts, its desire for personal elevation and political gamesmanship. And now those instincts were stirring once again. The first signs came in the form of policy reversals. A senior minister, emboldened by new alliances, proposed undoing several land redistribution initiatives that Shinmyung had supported in her final years, programs that had granted land to families displaced by earlier conflicts. The justification was framed as economic efficiency, but the intention was transparent. Restore land to aristocratic families whose loyalty had been uncertain. Haijong, remembering his mother's stance, resisted, but the vote in council was close, and the voices calling for reform grew louder. Soon after, A group of military officials petitioned the court to elevate the status of regional commanders, giving them broader autonomy in taxation and conscription. Again, it was couched in administrative language, but it was a bid for decentralization, a reversal of the queen's lifelong effort to bind the realm through shared governance. Haijong delayed, but he could not ignore the momentum building beneath him. Then came the fractures in the royal family itself. Queen Shinmyung had managed the rivalries between Wang Geon's many sons with delicate balance, offering titles, appointments, and marriages that kept the court's bloodline cohesive. But with her gone, those rivalries re-emerged. Two half-brothers of the king, both with provincial backing and ties to influential generals, began cultivating factions within the court. They challenged Haijong's appointments, questioned the legitimacy of his religious affiliations, and spread rumors of favoritism towards certain clans. It was not open rebellion, it was erosion. The temples, once firmly aligned with the court through Shinmyung's careful patronage, began to divide in their loyalties. Some abbots aligned themselves with regional lords, accepting private patronage in exchange for political messaging. The unity between spiritual and temporal power, so carefully woven by the queen, began to fray. Prayers once chanted for the kingdom now included veiled references to justice being restored or rebalance returning to the land. The monks were not seditious, but they were no longer unified. In this atmosphere of increasing uncertainty, King Haijong found himself haunted, not by ghosts, but by expectations. He had been raised in the shadow of perfect discipline, molded by a mother who anticipated fractures before they could form. But now, without her foresight, he was forced to react rather than preempt. And reaction in court politics is often mistaken for weakness. His attempts to convene a council of reconciliation, a gathering of noble families, generals, and temple leaders, was met with tepid participation. Several key figures declined to attend, citing travel delays or illness. The absences were symbolic. Haijong still held the crown, but he no longer held the gravitational pull his mother had wielded. The court had begun to tilt away from the center. Among the most troubling developments was the rise of private militias among the noble families. Under Shinmyung, these armed groups had been banned or quietly absorbed into the royal guard. But now, in several provinces, they re-emerged, first as ceremonial escorts, then as tax enforcers, and eventually as full-fledged paramilitary forces loyal not to the king, but to local interests. Haijong's attempts to disband them were ignored. His authority, once unassailable under the shadow of his mother's moral credibility, was now negotiable. And yet, even as the cracks widened, the king resisted the pull of authoritarianism. He did not declare martial law. He did not execute dissenters. Perhaps he hoped that the legacy of his mother's patience would guide the court back to balance. Perhaps he feared that in trying to hold everything together, he might become the very tyrant Goryeo had once fled. But in his restraint, he lost momentum. The queen's absence was also felt in more intimate ways. Within the palace, the rhythm of the court changed. Festivals were less carefully curated. Rituals began later, ended sooner. The aesthetics of discipline softened. Ministers arrived at meetings with less precision. The women of the court, once organized into circles of influence under Shinmyung's supervision, now drifted into rival cliques. Gossip replaced guidance. A culture of refinement gave way to subtle indulgence. It was in this atmosphere that a major crisis struck. A drought, severe and unyielding, devastated the central provinces. Crops failed, wells dried, famine threatened to undo years of careful economic progress. The people looked to the throne for response. But the mechanisms Queen Shinmyung had once personally overseen, emergency granaries, coordinated relief through temple networks, rapid distribution through merchant guilds, had fallen into disuse. The court fumbled. Debates over grain prices and jurisdiction delayed action. When aid finally arrived, it was too little and too late for many. Public trust, so delicately maintained under the Queen's watch, began to slip. Murmurs of discontent spread among the peasantry. Ballads were sung about the mother who fed the hungry and the sons who forgot her ways. In temples, prayers for rain were accompanied by appeals for wisdom to return to the court. Haijong, weary and isolated, sought counsel. He turned to his mother's scrolls, reading late into the night her notes on governance and ritual. He reassembled what remained of her circle, aged scribes, retired ministers, senior abbesses, and asked them not for policy but for remembrance. How had she balanced so much? How had she made stillness feel like command? Their answers varied. Some spoke of her intuition, others of her endless preparation, but all agreed on one truth. Her greatest strength had been her humility, the knowledge that power could only be sustained if it served something greater than itself. That unity was not a throne, but a habit. Armed with this reflection, Haijong began to rebuild, not through force, but through rededication. He reopened the Pavilion of Autumn Silence, turning it into a school for court pages and young ministers. He restored the granary system. He sent emissaries to temples not with demands, but with apologies. Slowly, some confidence returned, but the fractures remained. They were not healed, only acknowledged. The Queen's legacy, once a seamless garment of purpose, now bore seams and stitches. The unity she had forged was no longer natural. It had to be taught, maintained, struggled for. Her absence had revealed just how much of Goryeo's early harmony had been her silent design. And yet, even in fragmentation, her lessons endured. Not as doctrine, but as memory. Ministers still quoted her maxims. Peasants still invoked her name during childbirth blessings. Monks still left offerings beneath her likeness in stone. The fractures in the legacy did not erase it. They only proved how carefully it had been built, and how irreplaceable she truly was. Time has its own way of erasing, of softening the edges of memory until even great names become whispers in the corners of records and rituals. Yet some figures refuse to vanish, not because they demand to be remembered, but because the very world they left behind cannot forget them. Queen Shinmyung was such a presence. She did not leave behind a mausoleum, nor monuments carved with her likeness, nor grand tombs rivaling kings. Instead, she left behind a kingdom shaped by her silence, and a court that continued, even in disarray, to orbit a memory too foundational to discard. Her legacy endured not through proclamations but through stone, quiet, unmoving, eternal. In the years after her passing, as Goryeo moved into a more volatile phase of its history, King Haijong often returned to the places his mother had touched. He wandered the gardens she had once designed, lingered in the temple pavilions she had helped construct, and stood before the pine-covered hills where she had requested her ashes be scattered. In each space, there was a stillness that no politics could corrupt. These were the places where she had thought, written, and quietly directed the arc of a nation. They were not official memorials, but sanctuaries of reflection. What began as a personal ritual slowly became a public one. Ministers and scholars began visiting these sites, at first in secret, then as part of official travel. Pilgrimages emerged, not to mourn, but to contemplate. The Queen, who had never ruled, became a figure of inquiry among young officials and monks. Who was she? How had she exercised so much power without ever claiming it? What was it about her absence that felt more commanding than the presence of many who had worn crowns? The Pavilion of Autumn Silence. The writings were unlike anything in Goryeo's official canon. They were sparse, elegant, often more poetic than prescriptive. She posed questions, not commands. When does the kingdom end and the people begin? She asked in one scroll. In another, if silence holds the truth, who dares to speak? These writings spread across the country. In temples, abbots read them alongside the Tripitaka. In court schools, aspiring ministers debated her passages as if they were sutras. Even military officers, known for their skepticism toward courtly intellect. Yet in each, her legacy remained the center. No one dismissed her entirely. Even her critics acknowledged her influence. And perhaps this was the clearest sign of her endurance. She could be interpreted, reframed, even challenged, but never ignored. Meanwhile, the physical markers of her life began to emerge. Not from the court, but from the people. A stone pillar was erected near the stream where she had once distributed rice during a famine, carved with a single line. Here, she waited for no thanks. In the southern provinces, villages began setting aside a day each autumn to read from her writings and share rice cakes in quiet gatherings. They called it the Day of Still Waters. He designed a space inspired by her life, a place of symmetry and stone, of narrow paths and open courtyards, of reflection without ornament. The garden, called Mui-won, the garden without will, became a destination for poets, exiles, and dreamers. No statues, no banners, no altars. Just space. Space to think, to remember, to imagine. Years later, the garden would receive royal recognition. But even before then, it functioned as a kind of living memorial, one that required nothing but presence. For it was presence, after all. The trials of succession, of factionalism, of regional unrest continued. He was not a weak king, but neither was he a transformative one. His reign bore the marks of his mother's discipline, but also the limits of her restraint. He kept the kingdom together, yet never managed to reignite the unity his mother had forged. And perhaps that was inevitable. For what Queen Shinmyung had created was not a repeatable formula. It was a singular architecture, dependent not on structure, but on her. Her ability to read silence, to anticipate fracture, to soothe conflict without escalation, these were not skills that could be inherited. They could only be remembered. And memory, though powerful, is fragile when not renewed. The younger generation of ministers, raised on her teachings but distant from her presence, began to reinterpret her legacy. To some, she became a model of feminine governance. To others, she symbolized the dangers of invisible power. Still others viewed her as a quasi-mythical figure, an ideal of balance that could never again be achieved. She became, in essence, whatever the moment needed her to be. But the stones did not change. The pillars, the courtyards, the garden, these held no opinions. They simply existed, still, quiet, and enduring. They reminded each new visitor of the calm she had cultivated, of the kingdom she had helped birth, and of the wisdom she had never forced but always offered. In the final years of Haijong's reign, he commissioned one last scroll to be placed in the pavilion of autumn silence. It bore no title, no signature, just a single passage. She moved like a shadow, but built like a mountain. In her stillness we found shape. In her memory we remained standing. And so, Goryeo continued, not unbroken, not unchallenged, but enduring. And as long as the stones held their place in garden and court, as long as her scrolls were copied by hand and passed along by voice, Queen Shinmyung remained. Not ruling, not speaking, not even present, but remembered. But it is also the quiet ones who leave behind legacies too deep for stone and too wide for song. Queen Shinmyung was such a figure. As Goryeo aged, shifting through reigns and rebellions, triumphs and losses, her name was less frequently spoken aloud in council. Yet everywhere the kingdom turned, to its rituals, its rhythms, its sacred spaces, her presence was felt. Not because she ruled, but because she had given the kingdom the shape through which others could. Her son's reign ended, as all reigns do. Haijong passed without spectacle, succeeded by brothers and nephews, by distant relatives, by kings whose grip on power was firmer or looser, depending on the age. Dynasties are long rivers, and no one name holds them forever. But through the turbulence that followed, Queen Shinmyung remained a fixed point, a star that did not fade, even as constellations shifted. Monarchs changed, but the pavilion of autumn silence endured. Ministers quarreled, but the ethics of restraint that Shinmyung modeled remained a reference point. Wars flared on the kingdom's borders, but the garden called Mui-won never closed. In those places, she was not mythologized, not deified, but remembered as she had lived. Calm, steady, and essential. 100 years after her death, A chronicler in the royal archives compiled a volume titled The Women Who Shaped Goryeo. It was a modest effort, intended only for scholarly use. Yet, in its pages, Queen Shinmyung was given more lines than any other consort, more than some kings. The chronicler wrote, "Her power was not in what she did, but in what she prevented. She held the tide before it rose. She taught kings how to wait." That volume, copied and read by generations of scholars, helped anchor her legacy in formal history, not as a political outlier, but as one of the dynasty's architects. Even in foreign accounts, particularly Chinese and Japanese envoys who recorded their impressions of the Goryeo court, Queen Shinmyung's name appeared, sometimes indirectly. They remarked on the discipline of Goryeo's court etiquette, the curious structure of royal women's education, the prominence of Buddhist ceremony in state affairs. Behind each of these was a decision she had once made, a structure she had once insisted upon, a silence she had once kept. But perhaps the most remarkable testament to her legacy was not written by courtiers, nor monks, nor kings. It was told by commoners, the mothers who sang lullabies that included her name, the scribes who recited her verses when facing difficult decisions, the farmers who marked the Day of Still Waters each year not with grandeur but with shared food and reflective silence. These were not state rituals. They were cultural memory, and they had survived not because the court enforced them, but because people chose to carry them forward. Her influence, once concentrated in palace halls and temple altars, had seeped into the foundation of Goryeo's very identity. She had not shaped a moment, she had shaped a culture. In the centuries that followed, when later queens ascended with more visible power, they were often compared to her, not because they lacked authority, but because she had redefined what power could be. They were measured by her silence, her steadiness, her foresight. Artists painted her not as an empress robed in gold, but as a figure seated by a window with scrolls in her lap and pine trees beyond the screen. Writers invoked her when describing balance, political, emotional, moral. Even rebels who denounced the court occasionally quoted her, not to challenge her values, but to remind others what had been lost. In one later legend, likely apocryphal, but widely told, a minister in a moment of crisis is said to have asked, "What would the Queen of Silence do?" It became a proverb of sorts. A whisper passed through generations during moments when action threatened to outpace wisdom. And yet, for all her legacy, there remained one truth that stood unresolved in the heart of history. She never ruled. Her husband had worn the crown. Her son had passed it on. The lineage continued. The rituals expanded. But the crown had never rested upon her head. Some modern historians would argue this was an injustice, that she should have been granted a title beyond consort, recognized officially as regent or co-founder. Others argued that such recognition would have undermined her method, her meaning, that to name her ruler would have confined her within the same definitions she had transcended. Perhaps both views are true, perhaps neither. What remains undeniable is this: without her, there would have been no Goryeo as we remember it. No smooth succession, no coherent court, no rituals to bind provinces together, no unified image of the kingdom. Without her, the name Wang Geon would be a general's name, not a dynasty's foundation. Without her, the harmony of early Goryeo would have cracked before it could echo across centuries. She was the invisible architecture of power, the unspoken line in every royal edict, the hand that arranged the pieces without moving them. And in the end, her greatest act of governance may have been the choice not to govern, because by never claiming the kingdom, she allowed it to belong to all. In her name there was no conquest. In her silence, there was no absence. And in her kingdom, there was no monument higher than the memory she left behind. Her name was Shinmyung, her son was king, but the kingdom was hers, too.